Class 119 of the Golden Doves were Freedom, Language, and Negativity, Section 1, Freedom and Creation. There are two aspects to freedom. One metaphysical and the other linguistics. That's important. So Western world, when they think of freedom, they think of an actual metaphysical freedom. So I'm free, I exist, and in my existence I can do whatever I want to do, right? That's a metaphysical freedom. Jewish people, the Torah thinks of a linguistic freedom. That's interesting because linguistics is what makes us essentially human, right? So there's a linguistic wisdom is the essential character of a human being, right? So we think in terms of linguistic freedom. What does that mean? Okay. With the exception of the Epicureans, the pagan world believed the cosmos to be governed by necessary and uniform laws. So there are these scientific rules, they're necessary rules, they apply everywhere equally, right? They're uniform equally, just like natural law. Just like natural law applies, morality applies everywhere in the same way. There's no difference from one nation to another, from one circumstance to another circumstance. Then there's these rules that govern reality. Man is part of the cosmos and is determined by absolute laws. So now these laws, they limit man because these laws apply equally to everyone, including man. Therefore, at the metaphysical level, man cannot be totally free. So freedom is not possible because metaphysically you exist within a particular framework, and this framework has rules, and these rules, they basically determine what you can and cannot do. Right? So for example, I want to fly to the moon. You can't fly to the moon, right? So at that level, I guess I'm not free in metaphysical thinking. Even Plato and Aristotle, in speaking of man's voluntary actions, do not mean voluntary in the sense of absolute freedom. So for Plato and Aristotle, there are certain things that are voluntary, meaning I decide that I want to pick up this cup now, and I'm not going to drink it, I'm going to put the cup back down. That's a voluntary action, right? And yet I don't have absolute freedom. For example, I can't make this cup fly to me. If I want to drink it, I would have to stretch out my hand and grab it. So the idea of absolute freedom in Aristotelian and Platonic thinking. Right, and yet, they mean it rather in the sense that man is free from external compulsion and that he acts knowingly, right? So I knowingly decided to pick up this cup or not to pick it up, right? But that's not absolute freedom, right? So you can have voluntary actions. Just because you have voluntary actions doesn't mean you have absolute freedom. That's the point in Aristotelian thinking and Platonic thinking. Internally, however, even when acting voluntarily, man is determined by his own mechanism. So there is an internal mechanism that governs me, and there is no absolute freedom because I'm always governed by this internal mechanism, right? Again, this is in metaphysical thinking, right? Absolute freedom is an illusion, a concept particularly significant for Hegel, right? So for Hegel, absolute freedom is an illusion, and Ernst Cassirer explained Hegel's position as follows. Indeed, according to Hegel, the ultimate subtlety of reason consists in the very fact that it forever appears in the form of independence to the individual, completely seducing him with this deception, but without the least guarantee of actual independence. Very interesting. There's a certain truth to what Hegel is saying here. He refers to the subtlety of reason. So I have a brain, and I use this brain to reason, and I reach rational decisions. And so I'm convinced that my rational decisions are absolutely correct, right? Because I use my rationale to think them. Hegel says this is a seductive type of deception. Why? should I assume that my rational faculties, let's call it, my reasoning faculties, will necessarily lead to a rational, correct perception, to a rational, correct decision, to a rational, correct understanding? Why? There's a certain truth to what Hegel is saying. I mean, Hegel is taking it to an extreme. But as long as we're discussing this, I want to understand that a great example is the theory of evolution. You know, it is a scientific fact that there is no God. I mean, how could a scientific fact negate the existence of something that is outside the realm of science by definition, right? Because God, as the creator, is the writer of the scientific rules, right? That's how we understand God in Bereshit. So it is a scientific fact. If I live in Othello, it is a scientific fact that there is no such thing as a writer of this story, William Shakespeare, whatever you want to call the writer. Well, yes, if you exist in the book, right, Othello, right, there is no William Shakespeare, right? You can say that. I mean, that's scientific fact, or right? But of course, that's silly. But the point I'm trying to make, all these the science teaches us, well, that's just a fraud, but just the science actually means the particular a group of scientists that we fund, and we fund them because we know they're going to say what we want them to say. That's what the science teaches us means. Those scientists that are willing to say what we want them to say, and therefore we're going to give funding to their research. That's the science teaches us. But if another scientist says something else, that's not the science teaches us. So you see how we have this, like, you know, we think we're reasonable, we're rational, we're scientific, right? No, we're not. But here's the great question. And again, I don't agree with the full extent of Hegel here, because he takes it to a purely deterministic, almost fate-like intellectual process. And I don't agree with that on Hegel, but he makes an excellent point, which I do agree with. So get back to the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution. So I am convinced that there is no God, because I have a mind, and my mind is rational, and I can think scientifically, right? A circular reasoning, by the way, right? My mind is rational, I can think scientifically, and therefore I reach scientific conclusions. What is scientific? What my scientific mind tells me. Okay, but it doesn't matter. Here's the thing. You posit that your mind, the brain, is the product of a series of coincidences, right? Many coincidences. A lot of coincidences, building upon each other. This mind that is the product of coincidences tells you that the mind is rational, right? But you just said that the mind is just a product of coincidences. So why are you so sure that your mind can reach a rational decision? That's glaring intellectual defect in the very foundation of the theory of evolution. The foundation of the theory of evolution is I have a rational mind and I will reach a rational decision. There is no God. But if you say there is no God, then you're saying that your mind is just a bunch of, just coincidences or things, randomness. So you're so sure that the product of randomness, the human mind, is going to reach a rational decision? Maybe your mind is just telling you that you're being rational. Maybe far from being rational, you're actually very arrogant and have a lot of hubris. You see, in the Jewish thinking, we don't have this problem because we posit that God gave us intellect. God created us with intelligence. I feel very comfortable using my intellect to reach the conclusion that there is a God for that reason, right? But anyway, so there's some truth to what Hegel wrote here. So there's a seduction of reason, right? Deception, but without the least guarantee of actual independence. So you think your reason is actually, I am free to think. Hegel says, no, actually, you're not free to think, right? you have a particular internal mechanism, and that internal mechanism you call thought, and you experience it as thought, it doesn't mean you're free to think. The same idea was expressed by Borges in The Chess. The Chess is a poem written by Borges. Let me just check if I can see something about that. I am sorry for the interruption. Yeah. Okay. They do not know it is the player's hand, the pieces of the chessboard. They're not aware of the chess player. Just like Othello is not aware of William Shakespeare, right? Right. So they do not know it is the player's hand that dominates and guides their destiny. So the queen thinks, I have to go this way. Yes, I made a decision to go this way. Well, actually there's some strategy here that you're not aware of. And you've been moved into that position for a particular reason, right? And it's not always obvious why. They do not know an adamantine fate controls their will. Adamantine is like an unbreakable fate, meaning there's a series of events and it's a plan and a direction, and you're just part of that plan. You're just one of many steps in a plan, right? And lays the battle plan, right? So there is a battle plan, but you didn't make that battle plan. God moves the player, right? Interesting, you were thinking about the player playing chess, weren't you? What about the one playing the player? God. God moves the player. He in turn the piece. But what God beyond God begins the round of dust and time and sleep and agonies. So there's different gods that move us. Could be CNN, could be whatever news outlet you like. So we live in this particular matrix, right? So there's a God above us. Yes, the CNN, the New York Times, or whatever the God is. It doesn't matter. And it moves us. We hate Russia, or we hate Ukraine, and depending on where you are. And I'm not expressing an opinion about Vladimir Putin, who's of course, he is actually a mass murderer. But it doesn't matter. I'm not here to discuss politics or to defend myself. I'm just pointing out that we hate certain people. Some people hate Trump. Just as an example, somebody pointed out recently that Biden he's actually, everybody understands he's an incapacitated elderly man who barely can put a word together or a sentence together. So somebody said, I will rather vote for a dead horse than to vote for Donald Trump. So you see how we are chess pieces, and people are playing with our minds, right? So you think you're free. You're not free. You hate certain people. You love other people. There are things that are correct. Of course it should be like that. And there are things that are incorrect, right? We're being played, right? So there's these organizations that control our minds, right? But of course there's the ultimate God that is above everything. And the ultimate God that is above everything has a particular plan. We don't know what that plan is. So we are the pieces of the pieces of the pieces. We're somewhere down here, right? There's a pasuk in Kohelet that I want to bring to your attention as I'm reading this pasuk. I'm thinking of the pasuk in Kohelet, which is in Perek He, pasuk Zayin, I think. Yeah. Here it is. I found the pasuk. Im oshek rash ve'vezel mishpat v'sedek te'eh b'medina. If you see the people are oppressing the poor, people rob, and you see this in the city or the country that you're in, that robbery is accepted. It's part of the justice system. Inequity is part of the justice system. Somebody recently commented in New York, it's a woke city, and the DA here doesn't like prosecuting criminals. So you can just go out, beat up old ladies, I don't know what, and you'll just be out on the street again. That's just an empirical fact. But so what do you have to do to actually get arrested and put on trial for New York, you have to defend against the crime. If you defend against a crime, they'll come after you with the full force of the law. There's been a few situations where people defending themselves and defending others, they're immediately, they will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So you want to get arrested in New York and prosecuted, try to stop a crime. They will come after you. So that's V'gezen mishpat v'sedek ter'eba medina. Al titma al hafez. Don't be surprised at what is happening here. So you say, look at this, what is going on? Ki gavoa me'al gavoa shomer. There is a God above all these minor gods. They're not real gods, of course. Lo yelech alim rachim panai. I don't mean it in the sense of a deity, but there's these things that govern, right? Like in the Borgian chessboard, right? But there is an ultimate gavoa, ugvohim alehem. There's a malachim, there's different things, but there's the ultimate gavoa, which of course is a kadosh baruch hu, and so that's what's happening. There's a plan here, believe it or not. Only the Epicureans who denied causality and maintained that the world is a result of chance could believe that man's actions were free and undetermined. So part of the thinking of Hegel and Plato, Hegelian thinking apparently is that there's a certain determinism in man's action. This follows some of the modern thinkers today, who I just don't find them to be intelligent, but people like Yuval Harari, who think that there is no free will, and as a scientific matter, we can see that there is no free will. It's a scientific matter. It's just the intellectual level is too low to argue with. But anyway, so there is this determinism, right? So nothing I do is free, according to that thinking. But the Epicureans, oddly enough, were Apikonosim. They denied causality. That's very interesting. And they maintain that the world is a result of chance. And they believe, therefore, that because there is no causality, and because the world is a result of chance, on that obviously we disagree with Apikonosim. That's why they're Apikonosim, right? But they also believe that man's actions are free and undetermined. Freedom is an absolute category in spite of causality. Freedom as an absolute category in spite of causality was first introduced to Western thought by Philo. Right? So Philo is the one who says, yes, there is causality, but also there is freedom. So again, in Hegelian thinking, or Aristotle and Plato, there is causality, and therefore there is no real freedom. There's some things that are voluntary actions, but you don't have absolute freedom. Among the Epicureans, there is no causality, and therefore there can be absolute freedom, but they also reject God. Philo, great Chacham, he says that yes, there is causality, and still there is absolute freedom. This is a basic biblical doctrine. Mechila, I just want to check make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, good. Right. So, finishing Philo. This is a basic biblical doctrine, particularly essential to Judaism, that teaches the absolute responsibility of man. Man is free in a double sense. His activities are not determined by a fate external to him. So we reject fate. There is no fate that you'll be a Rasha, that you will be a Sadiq. No, you choose. There is no fate. And his activities are not the effect of his own internal mechanism. Now, we reject the idea that there's an internal causal mechanism within me which says you will do this, you will do that, you will do that, you will do that. We reject the Yuval Hararis of the world. Man's freedom is perfect. Right? He is free even when facing God, which is unbelievable. Even in the presence of God, freedom is maintained, which means freedom of man is absolute. Cain lied to God. Right? He lied to God. Right? He tells God, Hashomer achi anochi. How would I know where my brother is? Right? God asks her, right? Where your brother is. Hashomer achi anochi. Moses did not feel compelled to listen to God's plea to save the people from Egypt, right? So Moses was arguing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu for 7 days in the Seneh. He didn't want to go to Mitzrayim to redeem the Jewish people. Yonah refused to obey God's command to preach to the Ninevites, right? Yonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. Neither wisdom, nor piety, nor sanctity can alter man's freedom. Man is always free. You can be a Sadiq, Hacham, Hasid, you are free. You are always free to do an Avon, you are always free to do a Mitzvah. King Solomon was very wise, and yet he sinned. King David, the traditional biblical symbol of piety, was responsible for the sins of adultery and murder. Even right. Harasachta begam yarashta, right? Even Moses, the servant of the Lord, who spoke mouth to mouth with the Lord, sinned, implying thereby that he was free. Parashat Chukat, this week's parasha. Interesting, we got here, right? God told him, ledaber el hasela, and he was makeh et hasela. God told him to speak, and he hit the sela. He was free. Moshe Rabbeinu, in the presence of God, was free to contravene God. So man's freedom is absolute. We will continue Beli Neder in the next class.